Set 7 is growing ever closer to being released, and with that, all the cards have been officially uploaded onto Dreamborn, which means the deck building has begun and people are testing. So, what decks that might not be normally in the meta might be now moving into the meta? What do those deck lists even look like, and what can we expect when this meta gets finally released? What is that going to mean for all of us? All of that and more starting right now. So with that, it's always kind of a little bit difficult to be able to determine what's going to be happening with this next meta. There's a lot to say, and especially with how much support has come for every single color, it's going to be so difficult to be able to correctly even aim at where we are going with where this meta might end up. There are going to be probably some colors that are very surprising for all of us. Now, with that being said, that's not going to necessarily be discounting anything out of the ordinary, and there's going to be, of course, the regular meta decks that should still manage to stay in the meta. At the same time, everything has gotten some massive support, and now that we have all the cards released, we know exactly what colors those are. In this case, and from what it seems like, it looks like Sapphire might have gotten the best support, and with one of the best cards probably ever created for this game, which is the new Tamatoa. Now, for those of you who don't know, that is a legendary. It's probably going to be the most expensive card in this set if I have to predict correctly. And with it, it is a very good card in the fact that you are able to, when it plays, you are able to take two items from your banish zone and put them back into your hand. And then also, when you go ahead and quest with the Tamatoa, you can play an item for free. So that is going to automatically be throwing in a free lucky dime or things of that nature, which means a lot of colors that necessarily might not have had the best coming into this last meta might be able to come back into this meta. For example, even like Sapphire Steel and things of that nature. So, what decks are we kind of looking at? Well, let's go ahead and take a look. So with that right here, we're going to be diving into the first deck color of our choice. Now that is going to be some Baja Blast is what they're calling it. Now, of course, there's going to be a couple of different variances that we are going to be running into with this. This was one of the more interesting ones that I think will be a little bit more relevant in this meta in the sense of just how aggro it can be and how this can, in a lot of ways, even stomp over into the Ruby Sapphire. Now, of course, we haven't necessarily even seen what Ruby Sapphire is going to be able to do, and in that regard, it feels like it's still going to be the top deck in this next set. I could be wrong, but it still feels like, especially with the Sapphire support that it's gotten, this could really take a step up. It would also be really interesting to see if the Bell and Beast combo actually creates a different archetype of the Ruby Sapphire deck list in that case, seeing if those two can go off, but I still feel like those cards are still a little bit too slow for this meta in the fact of how high their costs are. With that being said, though, this meta is very interesting, and this deck list is also very interesting. Now, of course, there are still a couple of things I, in particular, would be changing with this list. For example, I still think that you still need 4 of the Sail the Azurite Seas. This also necessarily doesn't have the Geyser in it. Does it need it? Yeah, not really, especially for your uninkable count. That might be a little bit difficult to be able to find, but it still has some really interesting options. And the thing to keep in mind is that with Geyser being in here, there's still a couple of changes that you could necessarily want to make, especially with the Prince John Mirror and things of that nature. Now, the tough part is, of course, the uninkable count can get pretty dangerously high. So you just need to keep those things in mind as you go about this deck list. But still, the amount of aggression that you can have, hit the ground running, do some bounce back, do some board control, and just have an absolutely great time. This is a very viable deck list. Now, of course, the new Baymax is going to be really interesting here, especially just because it can do a universal shift, meaning that it can go onto any character for a 4 cost. And I mean, making a 5/5 for 4. That's pretty good. And then even on top of that, it can go ahead and remove all damage counters on the character that it is put onto. So this also doesn't necessarily need a whole ton of ink to necessarily work, but it can utilize it. Now, of course, we do also play a couple of bells as well. The new bell I don't necessarily think in this list, or even in general, it's going to be nearly as good as what people are predicting. Now, the line that people are saying in this case is going to be as follows: that you go ahead and play a popsicle on one, then you automatically sack that after the card draw, and you go ahead and play the bell, so you have a 3-3. Some people are even theorizing that you're going to be playing one jump ahead, and then bell on turn 2 can sing one jump ahead, then you can go play ahead and play Sail the Azurite Sea or a Tipo to even get further ahead. Now, the difficult part about that is that, yes, while that is pretty fast and a good way to get you there, it's a little bit far-fetched on the consistency of that play, or even just having a 3-3 swinger is actually pretty good as well. But that's going to be the biggest thing. It's not necessarily, I think, going to be as consistent of a play. And it might even end up hurting a little bit because even though, especially for decks that are playing Hiram, you might not have that second item out onto the field. And so this is going to be an interesting time to test and see how that bell is. I could be wrong in that case, but just from what I've seen, being down a card from Bell as opposed to Hiram might not necessarily be as good. With that, this hero is going to be an interesting one that we want to dive into a little bit more. Now, he's interesting because he's a shift 5, and also on top of that, your Bloodborne characters that have a card under them gain evasive and ward, meaning that they cannot be targeted by spells, and they can go ahead and attack evasive characters. On top of that, hero even can also go ahead and quest for 5 and add a 4/6. That is going to be a force to be reckoned with. Now, of course, with that being said, too, is this going to necessarily be a list that I would run Dime under? Potentially. I would also be even almost okay with even running a few more items in this case, and even going with the Tamatoa again. I think that's just going to be one of the most dominant cards in this case. Still, this deck is incredibly solid in the sense of what it is able to do, and it is able to move just so fast on hitting the ground running on everything and just getting ahead as fast as they can to just make sure that they can quest a lot and, maintain a decent enough card draw, which, this deck is able to do, which is pretty cool. Next, of course, is going to be a more interesting one, mainly because I'm not going to talk about this deck too much, just mainly because I don't necessarily think it is going to be moving into the Tier 1. This is the deck that I desperately want to move into Tier 1, but I don't necessarily believe it will. Why is that? And the biggest thing that it comes down to, in my opinion, is that it just does not have the card draw consistency. There's a lot that has to go right for this deck, and that can be very difficult for you to be able to do so in this case. Unfortunately, even running the docks, running a whole new world and things of that nature, while that is pretty solid, some people are even running the Queen of Hearts, which has a Shift 2 line, which is pretty solid as well, or a Shift 3, something along those lines. And anytime that you challenge, you're able to draw a card. That's pretty great. At the same time, though, if you do end up missing any of those, then you just end up falling further and further behind. And also giving your opponent 7 new cards with a whole new world, while that does sound great, necessarily isn't all that impressive when you still need to maintain a good board state and hope that your opponent also maintains a good board state so that you can go ahead and attack it on them, gain insane amounts of lore, and whatnot. And that, of course, will come back down to Ruby Sapphire, for example, that don't play a lot of characters until the late game. And so even with Mushu having insanely epic kind of stat lines, being able to give resist to all characters who challenge in the turn that, your characters are able to challenge in that case. And then anytime something is challenged, you can go ahead and gain 2 lore on top of that. And it ends up stacking, which is absolutely insane. The new Mulan is absolutely crazy as well, though it is a 7 cost. Even the Shift 5 does make it a little bit harder to get out, but still, if it is able to get out, it's pretty solid. Same with the Maui Half Shark. You do have an infinite loop of where, with the, Mushu out, the Maui can go ahead with, even One Last Hope as well, being able to attack ready characters if they're a hero, which Maui is. Then he can just go ahead and swing into everyone directly that are ready or not, and then you go ahead and you can cycle through re-readying him up with the whatchamacallit card, the one step ahead or the one flame ahead, something like that. It's the red with Nafu or whatever his name is. It's a good card, and you can keep cycling back that with the Maui Half Shark and just continually play one to be able to get that combo and just wipe their board while also gaining lore like crazy, because you'll gain 1 for each action that is played, and then you'll gain 2 for each character that is taken out. It's pretty solid. Again, though, it does come down to I just don't think it's necessarily going to be tier 1 just because it doesn't have the card draw. If in following sets they do add card draw, it would need to be for Ruby, just because Ruby needs that kind of support. I don't want to necessarily be giving that to Steel. Steel is already powerful enough, and then some. I would say even so. I would say it's probably the 3rd most powerful color. I would say first would be Sapphire at this point after this set. And the last set, I would say it was Amethyst. But Amethyst, I still think, is going to be 2nd in this case. And then Steel even would be 3rd, though Amethyst and Steel are pretty close. So yeah, I think this is just going to be a tier 2 for those reasons. I still think it can place well in store tournaments and things of that nature, but it won't necessarily be anything to write home about just because of the lack of card draw. Now, this is going to be an interesting one that we are going to be seeing as well, potentially. I do also think that we might even see even a Amethyst Amber list as well, not necessarily in this video, but again, I do think that Sapphire is just going to be an absolutely insane build this set. Now, of course, this is not a refined list. This is a list that I found online that I think actually will still be viable, something to use. For example, I don't necessarily agree with having 4, of this song in particular. It just doesn't fit necessarily all that well, depending on the matchup, sure, but I would play maybe 2 at the most in that deck. The new Aurora is really interesting too, just being able to sing songs almost at a non-stop consistency, especially with the Alice. That can be really nice, giving her ward as well, so she not necessarily won't be targeted. And so all in all, I'm really interested to see how this list could play out. Do I necessarily think that this is going to be tier 1? Not necessarily, but I think it would be either high tier 2 or low tier 1. Kind of where Amethyst Steel I feel is at for this set, where it's not necessarily going to be anything to write home about, but it still will be able to do well, win some good competitions, place high, and potentially win. But that will be seen as few and far between, just like Amethyst Steel this set. I do like the ideas of this set. I do think in this case, too, instead of Blue, I would play the Donald Bodyguard instead. That can add also 1 lore to be quested with. You know, kind of goes better hand in hand with the Alice. Also, it's inkable in that case, too, so if you do get in a little bit of trouble with the ink. So this deck list still can be very refined in this case, but I do like where they're going, and this is a very good starting point for you to be able to build up your own deck list in this case as well. So I'm going to be curious to see what this deck list can do. And again, we're not necessarily going to be looking at anything with Ink Geyser as well, and this color combination isn't there, but this is one that I think is going to be next level again. I think this is going to be making a boost that is needed for this meta. Now, why is that? Well, I mean, Sapphire Steel was really decent in set 5 and had a lot going for it. Unfortunately, in set 6, it wasn't necessarily able to do all that much to be able to stay ahead of the meta curve. It still is able to do well, and we even have some people in the league that I end up running that they've been able to even place in the top 10 on our league, and we have over 60 players in the league, and they're able to play a Sapphire Steel deck and do so very efficiently. At the same time, though, there's still a little bit of consistency issues with this last set. But again, I say the new Tamatoa is just going to be absolutely a dominating force to be able to do so. Let alone with the Popsicle and Fortisphere that you're going to be able to play and cheap out, as well as the Maurice's workshops as well. Being able to play those is going to be absolutely insane. Now, of course, I would still probably play 3 Maurice workshops in this case. I wouldn't play 1. Just because if you can really get ahead on the card draw on this, then you are going to be sitting very pretty in that case. I'm also okay with having, playing 2 Hades, maybe knocking down the high cost Tamatoa in this case, 1. But I mean, you have all the items. And also what's interesting too, instead of the grab your sword, I would play the Bagheera in this case, because he's going to be able to be the inkable character where you can still pay the 5. You're not necessarily going to be able to sing to deal 2 damage, but that's okay. The Bagheera will still be able to quest for 2, and then when it gets destroyed, it deals 2 damage to all opposing characters, which can be an absolutely devastating blow. Fire the Cannons is still going to be a really good list as well, or a card to play in this list as well. I would almost even want to see a how far I'll go, just because that turn 4, being able to get that going, that's almost needed as well. And I would, because I mean, Sapphire, Ruby Sapphire is able to do that pretty efficiently. Um, but I mean, those songs are just so viable on getting you ahead, and making sure that you continue to have this ramp. Of course, this is still going to be a very, very solid list. Love what it's able to do, and especially in the mid to late game, if you can go ahead and get to the 5/5 ink pretty quickly in the first couple of turns, like it's meant to do, and maintain some very high card draw, I mean, you're just going to be having all the answers that you need to. Zeusing everything. I would also up the Zeus to 4 in this case. Really get the control down in that case. Because you're going to be able to take care of your opponent's board and then quest for an insane amount to be able to take the game. This is a deck I think is going to be surprising the meta probably the most. I think it can slide into those DMs very efficiently and get things done at a very fast level. With that being said, too, I do still think that Baja Blast, especially with the Ink Geyser, is going to be a very good counter in this case. Again, though, this is going to be coming down, and I hope we don't move into a meta where it's going to be Ruby Sapphire is the only deck that is necessarily played because of how dominant it is, and then everyone's going to also just be playing a Baja Blast to counter. I'm hoping that's not the case, and if that is the case, then it's going to be a very unfortunate meta, and I do think changes are going to be made in that case to make sure that the rest of the decks in this meta will have a better fighting chance, aka some particular bans might be coming out for Ruby Sapphire in that case, just to really kind of slow it down without necessarily hitting the other colors in that case. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what this meta is going to be able to do. There's a lot of decks that really can start to make a break into this deck list and these metas as well. And so I'm very curious to see what is going to be happening on this Set 7 release. We are so close. We're about 2 weeks away, guys, from these deck lists being released. What decks are you excited for? What new deck colors do you think are going to be breaking into the meta? And what kind of deck lists are you looking forward to? What also do you think is the most powerful card in this set? Me, myself, I do believe that is the new Tamatoa, but time will tell. So go ahead and let me know down in the comments below. And until next time, guys, have a good one.